Greetings, everyone. Today's session is Fake News, the Math Behind the Myths. Thank you for joining us. I'm Emily Williams, Director of Alumni and Family Engagement. Before we get started, as always, I have some light housekeeping. After this session, we'll be sending out an email with a recording of today's session, as well as a survey to gather your feedback on today's session. So keep an eye on your inboxes. Also, thank you to those of you who submitted questions in advance. Noah will address several of the pre-submitted questions during the webinar. If you have a question arise as you're listening, please feel free to put it into the Q&A box, and it will be considered for response during the question and answer session after the presentation. Lastly, if you need technical assistance, please use the chat box to speak with us directly. My colleague Bethany will be responding to your questions as best she can. And now today's featured speaker is Bentley University faculty member, Noah John Siracusa. Noah received a PhD in mathematics from Brown University and is an assistant professor of mathematical sciences here at Bentley. He previously taught at UC Berkeley and Swarthmore College. He has received multiple national grants to fund his research and has been quoted in Forbes, Financial Times, and US News. He is the author of How Algorithms Create and Prevent Fake News, exploring the impacts of social media, deep fakes, GPT-3, and more, about which Nobel laureate and former chief economist at the World Bank, Paul Romer, said, "There is no better guide to the strategies and stakes of this battle for the future." So, without further ado, please join me in virtually welcoming Noah. Thank you for joining us today, Noah.
All right, thanks everyone for coming. Let me start my screen share here. All right, so I was thinking, what would people want to see if they're spending an hour with me in an afternoon, at least here in Boston? It's a beautiful sunny day, and I thought, what would be more fun than taking a math quiz? So we're all going to do a quiz together. Luckily, there's only a little bit of math on it, but it is a multiple choice quiz. So I'm just going to go through these questions as a way to get us to kind of think about these things, and I'll present the answers. So if you want, you can kind of mark down your own answers. I'm not going to poll you and I'm not going to grade you, but you can kind of personally mark down your answers and see how you do. Okay, so the first one is just kind of a warm up. I'll read these out loud as I go through them. In which year was the following quote written? "Falsehood flies and truth comes limping after it, so that when men come to be undeceived, it is too late." Well, you can probably tell by the language, this is, somewhat historical, but it's interesting how historical it is. It turns out that this quote is actually from 1710, so quite early. And the reason I included this is just to show that it's been a long time that we've understood, or at least some people have understood, Jonathan Swift was an Irish satirist, that it's not enough to just correct the record. This comes up in fact checking. So there's all these ideas of how do we deal with things like fake news and misinformation. And one of the main tools we have is, well, we can fact check things. But it turns out it's not so simple, not just for technological reasons, but psychological. If you read the news and you hear some story or some fact or some figure, and then later you hear a correction to it, it's often we kind of anchor our psychology to the original presentation we saw, and we'll kind of not trust the further updates. So once something kind of gets embedded in your psyche, it's really hard to dislodge it. So this is an interesting quote that really captures a problem that we have now. This was a problem then, but it's kind of amplified. It's the same problem on steroids now, because in social media and the internet in general, information spreads so quickly. So if false information spreads rapidly throughout the network, if you see it online in any setting, it takes even a small lag to fact check these things might be too late, because the harm will be done. People will kind of be deceived. And as this quote says, it's difficult to undeceive people. Okay, but that's just a fun warm up. Here's another one that's also kind of in the warm up category. So a year ago, there was a survey that found what percentage of US adults rely primarily on social media for political and election news. And it turns out the answer is 20%, so 1 out of 5 people. This, it's hard to interpret a lot from this figure, because there's many different forms of social media of varying quality. Even within each social media platform, there's lots of, I'd say there's good news and bad news, meaning high quality and low quality. So there's nothing inherently wrong about this figure that a lot of people get their news from social media, but it is important to recognize this number has gone up, tremendously over the last decade. So our whole information landscape and info ecosystem are very different than they were 10 years ago, extremely different than 20 years ago. That's important to understand because we have this traditional idea that you read the newspaper or you watch the news to understand what's happening. And that's just not true for much of the US and much of the world. We interact with news in different ways. It's filtered through social media rather than being directly from sources. There's both good and bad. One of the challenges is that there's a lot of bad information, misleading things floating around. One of the good things of this is social media has kind of, in a way, it's democratized our news system. It used to be that there was these gatekeepers that were a very narrow demographic, only certain people, which unsurprisingly tended to be mostly white men of a certain class, were the news creators and the news producers. And now, we have blogs, we have social media, we have Twitter feeds from all different voices representing a lot more society. So this is good and bad that the news landscape is changing. We just have to be aware of this and recognize it. Okay, now we move on to more of the technical stuff. So this is a cross between math and computer science. The state-of-the-art deep learning text generation system. So you don't have to know what deep learning is. It's, if you've heard the phrase neural networks, that's what this is referring to. Some fancy artificial intelligence program for generating text. So it's a computer that writes things. One way to think about this system called GPT-3 is it's sort of like the world's biggest autocomplete. If you're typing on your phone and you type a couple words, it'll suggest the next word. GPT-3 has read vast troves of text, and it doesn't memorize the text. It kind of picks up statistical signals and correlations between words, and it turns all of that using the magic of deep learning into this text generator. So you can paste a sentence or a paragraph or a whole page of text, and it'll produce as many paragraphs or pages of text as you want. It really writes, human sounding language. It's very impressive to see if you haven't explored it yet. But just to give you a sense of the scale involved, so in machine learning, we do this process called training a supervised learning algorithm. Training means you feed it lots of data to then kind of teach it what to do. And here's this interesting figure. What percentage of the training database of the text that this algorithm has been trained on, that it's sort of read and processed, what percentage of all that training text does Wikipedia comprise? Let me put this another way. This algorithm in the training process, which by the way, cost about $10 million to get enough computational resources just to train this once. Luckily, once it's trained, we can use it freely as much as we want. So it's really a one-time cost. But in that training process, this algorithm read the entirety of Wikipedia, in addition to many other books and web pages and things. So the question is, all of Wikipedia it was read, what percentage of the total text that it read was just Wikipedia? And this one I find pretty surprising, 0.5%. I'm not sure what your guess was. My guess would be maybe 5 or 15%. Wikipedia is enormous, so I would expect it to be a significant percentage. But this is really showing you this algorithm read tons and tons and tons of text, huge amounts of the World Wide Web and scanned books. This is good and bad. The good is that it sees a lot of information. The bad is that we don't really know in a concrete sense what information it's seen. And people are finding many examples where it's producing racist, misogynist, offensive language, because guess what? When you read the web, that's what you're going to see, and that's what it learns how to reproduce. So we don't really have a great way yet of people nowadays this was a couple years ago that this was built. Now people are trying to kind of clean up the databases that they train these algorithms on. But even still, even if you get rid of a lot of the offensive stuff, just having truthful information is difficult. Even on Wikipedia, we can't necessarily trust everything we see. There's also been some funny things. People explored this algorithm, and you can ask it questions, and it very often just answers correctly. But people found interesting ways of tripping it up, like saying, who was the president of the US in 1600? And it mentions someone from the British royal family. So it knows a lot of trivia, but it doesn't admit when it doesn't know something. It just tries to find the best kind of statistical answer it can think of. It's fun to play with. I'll try to send a link afterwards so you can explore it. Okay, here's another way that machine learning is used to generate things. So the last one is about generating text. The next one is about generating faces, actual real lifelike photos of people. So there's a website that I'll show you in a second that allows customers to purchase a unique, untraceable, realistic, what's called deep fake photo. of non-existent people. I'll give you examples in a second, but just imagine a real human-looking person. This can it can conjure up human faces from the ether, from non-existence. And these are useful. The reason why I say untraceable is these have come up in disinformation campaigns. For instance, you probably remember in the most recent election, in the US presidential election, there was this story floating around that people weren't sure what to think of that claimed that Joe Biden and his son especially had these weird shady dealings in China. Well, it turned out that the main source for the original story was this Swiss analyst. I forget his name, but he kind of leaked these documents and reported this. And there was a photo of the Swiss analyst, and it later turned out that that was generated by this algorithm. That photo of what we thought was this person was actually just a fake conjured up image. It was a deep fake. So these are untraceable because if I just grabbed a photo from the web and used it and pretended that was my profile photo, you can do something called a reverse image search, like on Google. You can search the web for photos, and you'll find the original source of this. So if I, grab one of your faces in the audience and I tried to use this to kind of create a fake identity, it would be very easy to uncover it. These photos are untraceable because there is no human being with that face. It's not reusing someone else's photo, it's creating a new one from nothing. So now let's get to the question here. How much do you think this website, I didn't tell you what the website is, but how much do you think this website charges per fake photo? So this is to create a unique, authentic looking human face that only you can use and no one else in the universe has access to. Turns out $1. You can just buy dozens of these things at a bargain rate. And that's because the algorithm, once it's been trained by looking at lots of human faces, it's very easy and inexpensive to just run the algorithm over and over. So there's no real bottleneck or harm and you can mass produce these. So let me give you some examples. The website, not the one where you purchase them, but this other website, which has this fun game, is called whichfaceisreal.com. You can go to that. I recommend waiting until after the end of the talk, but if you're bored, you can go now. So it's just a web page that it keeps showing you pairs of photos where in every case, one of the photos is a real photo of a human being, and the other is a deepfake synthesized photo. So someone who doesn't actually exist. Looking at these two faces, at least to me, it is not at all obvious which is fake. One of these people is real. One was just conjured out of nothing by the magic of deep learning. In this case, I think the real one was the one on the left, just because I think the algorithm wouldn't really learn to create this extra piece of the face that's showing up in this photo. So the way it's cropped, I think, kind of gives it away. If you notice, the one on the right has kind of a piece of a face, but if you look at the ear and things, you can see it's kind of funny. So the algorithm did an incredible job of learning how to create a face in the center, and it's not quite as skilled yet as creating the background and the other objects. If you look at the background as well here, it gets kind of swirly. So I would say that the background objects look a little bit fake, but the face itself, to think that this person does not exist, it's just, to me, it's mind-boggling. If you're looking for the difference, you might be able to do it. But if you just saw this photo on, you go to a newspaper, you read an article, and there's the picture of the supposed journalist, I think it'd be very hard for this to leap out as fake. Plus, there's other examples where they don't have these artifacts on the side where it's even harder. Or let's do another example. This one, I could have chosen an easier one to see some of the fakeness because it's interesting. One challenge these algorithms have had, which I'm sure will be fixed, maybe they already are within the next year. The backgrounds tend to be a little funny. So the brick picture here on the right, that's pretty detailed and realistic. I think it's hard to learn how to do that. The one on the left looks sort of like rocks and maybe a seascape, but the way the hair blends into the background, you can see something's a little funny. And the other one is, for some reason, these algorithms often produce strange asymmetries, like different earrings in one ear versus the other, the teeth. Sometimes they'll have the wrong number of teeth or teeth in the wrong place. In this one, the most striking thing is the eyeglasses. It's sort of regular glasses on one side, sunglasses on the other. So in this one, it's a pretty good tell that it's fake, and it is. But nonetheless, I think you have to admit, if you look at the details of the hair, the face, and everything, it's just shockingly realistic. And I won't do it now, but if you go to this webpage, you can play and go through 100 of these, and you'll see it is extremely hard. I forget what percentage I get, a little better than 50%, but not much. It is often extremely hard to tell the difference. That's both frightening from a societal perspective and just mind-blowing and amazing as far as kind of being in awe of what artificial intelligence is capable of nowadays. Okay, next topic. According to one estimate, how much money, I made some of these slides for an international talk, so it'll keep saying US dollars. How much money did advertisers send to publishers of misinformation in the most recent year? So let me just elaborate what that means. If you go, so there's some newspapers like, let's say, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, some kind of established prestige ones where they might give you 1 or 2 articles for free, but the main way they make money is you have to subscribe. That's called the subscription model. Most newspapers nowadays, they make their money entirely through advertising revenue. If you go to, let's say something like BuzzFeed, if you go to a newspaper like that, and even some higher quality ones, Huffington Post and others, you'll see advertisements placed on it. So an advertiser is paying an algorithm, some system to distribute all these ads to various web pages like these newspapers. And the newspaper will make money based on the amount of traffic. So if the newspaper knows that they have, let's say, 1 million visitors every week, then they'll get a certain rate from the advertisers. If they have less than that, they get less money, et cetera. So the more web traffic you bring in, the more ad revenue you bring in when you host ads. So just remember the advertiser is paying these websites to host their ads. Well, some websites are not a valid newspaper, they're a fake newspaper. They produce junk news or misinformation. So here the question is, how much money do we think, and this is a ballpark estimate, we don't know exactly, did advertisers send to publishers of misinformation, to, let's say, fake news publishers? The answer is over $2.5 billion in the most recent year. I think this is maybe the most important slide in the talk. And the reason is we hear so much about fake news and misinformation once it's kind of spreading around on the internet, on social media. There's all these questions, and a lot of you sent in questions already that are really good questions about free speech and censorship and moderation and fact checking, sort of questions of what do we do after we have the fake news? But a really important question is, why do we have that much fake news in the first place? What's motivating it? Well, at the end of the day, everything is motivated by money, right? It may be political power, maybe people are trying to convince you to vote one way, liberal or conservative, but somehow the bottom line, most fake news is actually not politically motivated. I don't know about most, but much of it is actually financially motivated. People just figured out that you can publish trashy tabloid type of headlines. They don't have to be true. Just make them as scandalous as possible or appealing to people's predilections. Like if you hate Hillary Clinton, just make up whatever you want, anti-Hillary Clinton stuff. We saw a lot of that. And you'll draw lots of web traffic. Write a headline like, "You'll never believe what Hillary Clinton accidentally said while the mic was on." Tons of people will click that. So you get lots of traffic. So you get lots of revenue from ads. The truth doesn't matter as far as advertising revenue. You're not producing news, you're producing whatever draws in clicks. So the reason why I think this is so important is this is a huge amount of money that's flowing to fake news producers. And I believe this is kind of overlooked, not totally ignored, but overlooked. If we didn't send all this advertising money to fake news publishers in the first place, they wouldn't have this incentive to publish this stuff. If they're not publishing it, it won't end up online where it becomes a challenge to moderate. This is not to say we could just cut off all the funding and all fake news would disappear. There'd be a ton of random stuff anyway. There'd be political stuff. But I think this is a good way that we can try to think of how to cut back the amount of fake news we have. Don't think as much about censorship and free speech issues. Think about following the purse strings. Where's the money going? If we're sending money to fake news, that's already problematic. We don't have to silence the fake news or misinformation, but we don't have to send money to it and encourage people to publish it. How do you do that? Easier said than done, but I think this is a direction we need to think about more. So this is to say a ton of money is ending up in the hands of fake news publishers, and it almost entirely, if not entirely, comes from ad revenue. Let me give you a little more details on that question. So this is a pause from our quiz. Google algorithmically places ads. I say algorithmically because it's so many happening over microseconds that no human can do this, so they use computers. They place ads on their own properties and on over 2 million external websites. This is not so obvious if you're just using the web to know that this is going on. If I go to Google and I search for, like a toy or something for my daughter, I'm going to find a lot of advertisements at the top of the search, sponsored ads for kind of related things. Those are ads that are placed on Google's property. So Google's basically saying a lot of people are coming to Google and doing searches. Let's place some ads there because we can get some ad revenue that way. This is also how you see advertisements on Facebook. You'll scroll through your newsfeed and you'll see sponsored posts. Someone is paying to put ads on Facebook property. So that, I think, there's a lot of problems with it, but at least it's kind of transparent. You know what's happening. You're on Facebook, you see ads that Facebook placed. What's kind of murkier is Google has this network of over 2 million websites where it's distributing ads. So for instance, if I go to something like New York Times, they have subscription revenue, but they'll still post ads. Well, how did those ads end up on New York Times webpage? There's various ad distributors, but it turns out Google is the biggest one. So there's 2 million web pages that Google is spreading its ads to that are not Google. So many, many web pages that you go to, anytime you see an ad, it's not quite more likely than not, but it's the most likely distributor. The system that put that ad there is actually Google, even if the site you're using has nothing to do with Google. Let me expand on this. Did you know that 80%, so the vast majority of Google's entire revenue, which is $150 billion most recently, comes from advertising? So if I said, what is Google? You'd probably say it's a search company, or they have lots of services like maps and other things. You think of the products they produce. But if you look at the finances, 80%, so the vast majority of what Google is an advertising company. The whole point in Google, the reason why they have search and maps and everything else, is just to draw traffic. They just want to bring you to their website so that you will see the ads. They make money from the ads. That's why all their services are free, Gmail and everything. They just want to collect your data and to show you ads. I'm not saying that's necessarily bad. I love using all their free services, but it's just interesting to note that financially, that is where their money comes from. So again, it comes from not just the ads on their own properties, but also this service where they farm out ads to other sites. Here is something kind of striking. A couple years ago, an organization, a nonpartisan organization, sampled, basically they just collected a large sample of fake news or junk news or misinformation. There's lots of terms for this, but fake news sites, let's just call them, that had ads on them. And it turned out that Google was the service that had placed those ads 40% of the time. I'm not sure if it's changed since then in the last 2 years, but I think this is pretty shocking. Remember, I had that figure that $2.6 billion is going to sort of the fake news industry, let's say. This is saying that Google, at least a couple of years ago, was providing almost half of that funding. So when you're on Facebook, and we're frustrated at Facebook right now, and Mark Zuckerberg gets in the news a lot for all these problems like misinformation, I think it's important to remember a lot of the misinformation that's ending up there was funded by Google's ad distribution. And yet we seem to focus entirely on Facebook at the moment when there's other factors at play. Here's a weird thing too that is very shocking. Until quite recently, Google allowed its ad host sites to be anonymous. What that means is if you're an advertiser and you have your ad and you want to display it on websites, Google up until recently was allowing the sites to not indicate who they are. So the advertiser could choose specific URLs or at least see where their ads are going, but there's also this large category that just said anonymous. And the same organization that found this, one of these that did these studies, found all these horrible examples like reputable health organizations, like Sloan Kettering, I forget if it was the WHO, but lots of like national big name, very reasonable medical organizations where accidentally they found examples placing ads on fake news sites, and even ones that were like anti-vaccine. So not only is that terrible, imagine if you're, a global health organization, to have your ad shown on an anti-vaccine website that looks bad, kind of takes away your message. But even worse, it means these organizations are sending money to anti-vaccine organizations. They don't know that they're doing this because those are showing up in these anonymous sites. But it's just unbelievably how bad that is, that these organizations are sending money, propping up the very cause that they're trying to fight against, because they don't know that's where their ads are going. Not that that's the only place their ads go, but there's many examples of ads that have done that. Here's a kind of shocking and also not shocking figure. The most recent estimate in the entire global advertising industry. So I'm not talking just the US, I'm not talking just digital online ads. I mean everything, print, newspaper, radio, everything, all of the internet. The most recent estimate, Google and Facebook combined for 20%, so 1/5 of the entire revenue of the global advertising industry. So this is where ad money is. It's these two companies in their targeted digital advertising. Okay, this is setting the stage to kind of show fake news and misinformation. The stories we hear is, that they spread on platforms, and we have to figure out either you take them down somehow and then you violate free speech, or you leave them up and people get misled. That's all important, and I don't want to belittle that, but I just want to kind of highlight there's a lot of undercurrents, especially these financial ones, that are a very important part of the story that are not talked about as much because they're sort of less transparent, right? It's easy for me to go to Facebook and see some horrible post and say, look, this is anti-vax. It's a lot harder to know that Google, behind the scenes, unknowns to me, is funneling money from reputable organizations to these fake news publishers. That's happening, but you don't see it and experience it. So somehow it doesn't hit people as emotionally. Another example is that recent scandal that came out that Facebook, which owns Instagram, knows that Instagram is harming teen girls. That immediately led to a congressional hearing. It led to a lot of headlines. It's shocking and it's horrible, and I don't deny that. But it's just kind of, that's the most emotional, impactful part of the story that we're dealing with. There's a lot of other moving parts that we need our attention. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about the advertising revenue behind the scenes here. So here's another one still on the topic of ad revenue. When you purchase an ad on Facebook, so I'm an advertiser, and remember, advertisement doesn't mean you're just trying to sell things. You could be a political organization, you could be a nonprofit. It's anyone that's trying to draw attention for whatever reason. It's not just traditional sales type of ads. But if I'm an advertiser on Facebook, I'm an advertiser and I want to place an ad on Facebook, so I'm going to pay Facebook to do so, and it'll show up in some people's news feeds. Facebook gets to decide which users' news feeds exactly it's going to show up in. You can customize it. Like you can say, I want people who are interested in sports because maybe I'm advertising something sports related. So you can kind of choose topics and areas and interests. But once you do that, Facebook uses its algorithms to target which specific individuals that it thinks fits those categories. So here the question is, do you think if I go to Facebook, can I target my ads based on ethnicity and gender, or is that not allowed? Turns out the answer to this one is kind of yes and no. There is no real right answer. The yes is, it used to be. So for several years, for many years, Facebook just directly allowed this. You can go and choose categories to include and categories to exclude. So if you didn't want to show your ad to Black people, you could choose that on Facebook. It turns out that's federally illegal. There's a federal law, not in all categories, but in housing, credit, and employment. There's a federal law, I forget, from the 60s, I think, that prohibits that kind of discrimination in advertising. So if I'm going to, in other words, advertise a job, since that's an employment category, I cannot discriminate based on various categories like ethnicity and gender, and age, I think, is also included. So those are legally protected categories. And yet up until just like a year or two ago, I think it was 2 years ago, Facebook was just directly, overtly allowing that obviously illegal option. People kept complaining, journalists kept finding it, and somehow they just never got caught until it was actually during the Trump presidency, I think towards the end of it, that there was a big lawsuit with many organizations and it was finally settled, where basically Facebook had to acquiesce and say, okay, that's illegal, we're not going to do that anymore. So they stopped doing it. So that's why I said yes, because they used to allow it. That's why I say no, because they no longer allow it. But there's actually a little bit more yes to it as well. After it's been disallowed, some people did some studies, some academics, and they found that if you post an ad for a high-paying job, actually, let me give a more concrete one. If I post an ad for housing sales, so I'm selling a house, real estate, that's versus housing rentals. The housing sales ads will skew more to white population and the rentals more to Black population. Another horrifying example, if I post ads for high-paying jobs like computer scientist, that skews more male than if I post something like to a nurse or an elementary school teacher, that skews more female. So that's overt, blatant racism, sexism, not just that it's morally bad, but it's prohibited, it's illegal. But the problem is it's still happening because it's no longer that the user can specify these categories, but it's still kind of built into the data that trains Facebook's algorithms. So even though no human is saying, oh, let's send our high-paying jobs to men, the algorithm has just kind of learned through all the historical sexism and racism that's built into our social fabric and data. The algorithm has kind of picked up on our society's history of sexism and racism, and it reproduces it by sending these ads. And of course, that's horrible, for many ways, one of which is that it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's if high-paying jobs are going to be shown only to white people, or more statistically to white people, then that's going to be one additional factor that's going to keep perpetuating these income disparities. So it's kind of picking up on our past racism and sexism and then perpetuating it and even amplifying it because Facebook is such a large scale. So this is a tough question. The answer is more yes than no. It was allowed, it's no longer allowed, but it's still disallowed, but happening in the algorithm out of our control. And here's the really kind of sad, unfortunate thing. The best way we know of counteracting that built-in algorithmic bias would be to directly specify categories, like if you have a high-paying job, to specifically say, I want to target this to Black people, for instance, to counteract the bias and the racism, bias in the data. But we can't do that any longer because that was removed because it violated federal law. So somehow the one thing that might save us here is also the horribly offensive illegal thing that we got rid of. So it's tough. The only way to fix it now is to somehow fix the data these things are trained on, but there's efforts in that direction, but it's hard. We're a long way from succeeding there. So it's sad. All right, moving on to YouTube. Let me move my window here so I can see better. All right. What percentage of watch time on YouTube comes from the algorithmically recommended up next? What I mean is if I go to YouTube, someone might send a link or they might share a video on Facebook or some other platform, or I could go to YouTube and search for videos. There's various ways of accessing videos, but one of them are the up next videos. If I'm watching a video on YouTube, on the right, there'll be that little column of videos that'll say recommended up next videos. And by default, when my video ends, it'll autoplay the next video. So if I just let any video, go to whatever video you want, however you get there, if you just leave the computer alone or your phone alone, YouTube will automatically send you on this algorithmically chosen path through its videos. What percentage of total watch time on YouTube comes from these algorithmically recommended ones? The answer is 70%. And I think this is kind of shocking and uncomfortable because we as humans like to feel we have autonomy, that we get to decide what we're watching rather than a machine. But this is saying the majority, 70% of all the time that society is watching on YouTube, which is billions and billions of hours, it's a lot. The majority of that time, a computer algorithm is deciding what videos for us to watch. Less than 30% are the videos that we kind of specifically choose. Someone shares or I click on. Most of the videos you watch that the system has somehow chosen for us. That's neither good nor bad. I think it's unsettling. It's kind of a dystopian future type of thing. But what's dangerous is that means we're putting a lot of responsibility and faith in the algorithm. If the algorithm sends us down dark paths, like to conspiracy videos, extremist videos, that's going to have a big impact on society because a lot of people watch YouTube and the algorithm determines what a lot of people watch. So this doesn't necessarily mean it's a problem. It just means this is a huge risk. And it turns out it also is a problem. People have done some studies and they found there's kind of mixed conclusions, but sometimes in many different situations, they find indeed the algorithm kind of, once you show the slightest interest in anything that's kind of politically off in one direction, it kind of pushes you further and further, eventually into the extremes. So it is not just scary, but it's an actual legitimate problem. We're not quite sure the extent of it, that's debated, but it's something we have to be aware of. So how big is this issue? Well, let me just give you some numbers. These are just taken directly from YouTube's webpage. YouTube has over 2 billion users. 1 billion hours of YouTube video are watched every single day. 500 hours of video are uploaded every minute. So if you ever think, oh, why can't YouTube kind of fact check their videos? Why can't they take down the bad ones, the offensive ones, the misinformation? Well, one answer is, how could you do that if 500 hours of video are uploaded every minute? There's no way you could get a team of human moderators to do that. You'd have to trust algorithms to do that. And that's not so easy. Okay, next question on YouTube. Are anti-vaccine videos banned on YouTube? So have a minute to think about that. Could I just make a video saying vaccines are horrible, they turn you into mutant lizards, and don't take them? Or would that violate YouTube's policies? Here the answer is the one we would hope. It's yes, they are banned. But let me point out, this only happened a few weeks ago. This was last month. Up until literally just last month, the answer was no. You could post whatever anti-vaccine stuff you wanted. What happened was once the pandemic started and a lot of the companies tried to be more proactive in strengthening their policies, fighting misinformation, and all these harmful things, for some reason, YouTube decided to make a policy that that it was prohibited to post videos that were anti-COVID vaccine. So you can post factual news things, but you can't post a video, or you can post it, it'll get taken down, that claims COVID vaccines harm people more than the reality, that they are not effective. So you couldn't do anti-vax specific for COVID, but you were still allowed to do anti-vax in any other setting. So you could say that flu vaccines or any other vaccines, or just vaccines in general, are destroying society, and how Bill Gates is spying us. All that stuff was allowed. The reason they changed a few weeks ago, according in YouTube's own words, if you read their blog press release about this, they say that they've realized that some general anti-vaccine rhetoric has kind of spilled over and made people more COVID anti-vax. To me, this is just, probably to all of us, this is mind-boggling. How did it take people until now at YouTube to realize anti-vax might encourage people to be anti-COVID vax? This should have been obvious, from February 2020. I have no idea why it took them so long. I'm glad that they did this. I'm not convinced they're going to do this effectively, but how it possibly took that long and why this wasn't more of a scandal is shocking, but it is what it is. Okay, next topic, Google. So we're going to go back a little bit in history. A lot of this whole discussion of fake news, misinformation, everything, it kind of first hit a lot of our attention in 2016. Largely, however you feel politically, President Trump's victory was surprising to many people. And there was a lot of questions of not just how did it happen, but how did it sort of happen without us anticipating it and seeing it coming? And there's a lot of theories that social media might have played a big role, and we're still kind of grappling with that. So in the immediate wake of this, we were all kind of very surprised, and many shocked by the fact that Trump won. So a question was asked to someone prominent, November 6, 2016. So this is right after the election. I think this question was asked a week or within a matter of days, maybe a week after the election came out. The person was asked, could search results on Google potentially have played a decisive role in the US presidential election? So what I mean by that is things like people searching who should I vote for, or searching for like Hillary Clinton and finding all kinds of made up conspiracy things like that weird Pizzagate story. Could that kind of fake news that was showing up on Google searches have actually swung the election, made it not just influenced, but played a decisive role, meaning like tipped the balance in that election? This person responded by saying, sure, I think fake news as a whole could be an issue. So, saying that it could be an issue, what does that really mean? But look at the beginning, sure. So this person answered by basically saying, yes, I think fake news might have swung the election. So do you think this was said by a Google computer engineer who was working on the algorithm, but wasn't allowed to speak about it publicly? Do you think this was the CEO of Google? Do you think this was Hillary Clinton? Do you think this was Donald Trump? I think this is kind of a hard question, and it turned out the answer is CEO of Google. So imagine this, we have to go back in time 5 years. Trump wins the election, and a few days, and people start to get angry about fake news on Google, Facebook, lots of other sources. Someone asked the CEO of Google, do you think fake news on your system, on your company's main product, could have tipped the election towards Trump? And he answered, sure. We kind of forget that right now. We're all focused on Mark Zuckerberg, and this is not to exculpate him. He certainly has a lot of responsibility. But just a few years ago, there was a lot of ire towards Google as well that I think we should not forget about. Basically, they're all doing horrible things. No, they also do a lot of good things, of course. Imagine the world without Google, or even without Facebook, we'd miss out on a lot of very important things. So I'm actually not one of these kind of delete Facebook, all big tech or evil type of things. I just think they're so big, they have so much influence that we just need to recognize the problematic aspects of what they're doing so that we can try to fix it. I'm not really in a position to judge if one company is better than the other, if we should get rid of one, break them up. Those are difficult questions that, you know, a lot of people need to be involved in making the decisions. But my kind of personal role as a mathematician in this is just to study the facts, the figures, the numbers, the patterns, the data, and just see what is actually a legitimate threat that's possibly impacting our society. What are the various technological ways of dealing with these things? Just trying to understand the truth of what's going on. And then I'm hoping to leave it to others to figure out how do we respond. And that's an important debate. So I don't want to advocate a particular side necessarily. I just want to kind of remind us of what's happened and how we got to where we are. So let's go back to this CEO of Google, Sundar Pichai, says, yeah, fake news could be an issue. In contrast, around the same time, Mark Zuckerberg said, personally, I think the idea that fake news on Facebook, which is a very small amount of the content, influence the election in any way, I think is a pretty crazy idea. So here we have a very strong contrast. Facebook is basically saying there's no way fake news played a role. And sure enough, 5 years later, they're still in the news for kind of not admitting the scope of these problems. Whereas Google, at least 5 years ago, admitted this is a problem, we need to look at it. And I think Google has actually made tremendous strides in improving their situation. I think there's way less problematic material showing up on Google now than there was in 2016, because they really decided to attack it head on. Doesn't mean it's perfect and that they fixed it, but it's way better than it was. Facebook's also improved in some respects, but they have a long way to go. Okay, here's a really sad one. In 2015, a black software engineer, not working at Google, working somewhere else, but he tweeted and brought a lot of attention to the following. Google has a service called Google Photos that you can kind of store your photos in the cloud, and it uses artificial intelligence algorithms to tag things. So it'll recognize what objects are in there using computer vision, it's called, using artificial intelligence, recognize what objects are in there and automatically kind of categorize. So unfortunately, this black software engineer kept noticing that he would upload photos of himself and his girlfriend, and Google's algorithm was tagging both of them as gorillas. It's really hard to imagine something more offensive and horrible as that. In fact, a Google spokesman actually tweeted, and I apologize for my language, so official Google person responded by literally saying, this is f***ed up, how did we let this happen? So this was horrible. Moving past the horrible thing that happened, here's what I find really interesting. How was this problem fixed? So 2015, this horrible thing happened. It was in the news, it raised a lot of headlines, it was very upsetting, and rightly so. Google had to act fast. So they did what they could in the immediate term. They basically just kind of disabled parts of their algorithm. But let's fast forward 3 years later to 2018. The problem is mostly but not entirely fixed. But the question is how? Let me go through some options. One is Google just manually took out the word gorilla as a possible label and then just let its algorithms do whatever they're going to do. They just said, you can call anything whatever you think, just don't label anything as a gorilla. Another option, they switched to more recently developed deep learning. So deep learning has developed a lot between 2015 and 2018. The vision methods are much better. So they use better AI now. Another option, the problem was their original database was mostly white people. It wasn't diverse enough. So they retrained their algorithm on a more diverse database of photos. Or maybe it was both B and C. Maybe they have better algorithms and better data. Nope. The answer is, I don't know if it's still this way now, but at least 3 years after this horrible incident, the answer is they just got rid of gorilla. The way this was discovered was some journalists uploaded like 40,000 photos of all kinds of animals, and they found squirrel, zebra, giraffe, horse, every animal you could think of was detected correctly, like 99% of the time by Google, except monkey, chimp, gorilla, and a couple others like that never showed up. So Google just manually disallowed those labels because they were showing up in offensive ways. I think it's good that they kind of stopped this damage from occurring again, but I think it's kind of interesting. I don't know if it's sad, but it's just interesting to see that Google, one of the most advanced technology companies in the world with their state-of-the-art artificial intelligence, couldn't find a better way of preventing this than to just do the most simple-minded, naive thing of getting rid of the label. There was no better way that they could figure out of improving their AI. Maybe there is by now, but I doubt it's perfect. All right, I want to leave plenty of time for questions, and I tend to talk a lot, so let me go a little bit quickly through the next ones. A few years ago, Twitter revealed how many suspicious accounts it blocks every week. Turns out the answer was 3 million. So this is one example where we talk about all the harms of algorithms that's been in the news a lot. But I also think part of what I wanted to emphasize in the book and in this talk is as much bad stuff as algorithms do, given that we have the internet, we have social media, we have all these things, if we just didn't use algorithms at all, there'd be many, many other horrible things. So machine learning is automatically detecting and blocking 3,000 suspicious Twitter logins every single week. Sorry, 3 million. It's a huge number. There's no way you could go through this by hand. So algorithms are creating all these problems. They're amplifying racism. They're spreading misinformation. They're doing all these bad things, but they're also reining in a lot of horrible things that would be running amok on these platforms. So I just want to say, algorithms are neither good nor bad. They're powerful tools that have positive and negative applications and ramifications. And that's just one example of a positive one. On the other hand, algorithms are also powering these many suspicious logins. You can write a computer program that'll create a fake, what's called a bot account, and log in and post things. So it's really algorithms fighting algorithms. That's the world we live in. All right, last one. Leading up to the 2020 US election, which candidate called for a total revocation of the law? It's called Section 230, if you've heard about it, but the law that shields social media companies from liability. Basically, this is an old law from 1996 where there's a lot of horrible things on the web, and people in theory could sue your internet service provider for providing your computer with that horrible stuff anytime you go to a web page. So there's this law that sort of says the internet service provider is not responsible because they're just kind of the conduit through which the information flows. That was before social media, but we interpret, or the courts interpret, that law to apply to social media. Google is just kind of sorting the information that's out there. Facebook is just providing user-generated content. So the law, even if Facebook or Google hosts, if it's copyright violations, that's still illegal and they have to take it down. But if there's something offensive or harmful that happens on Google or on Facebook or Twitter, you can't sue those platforms because they're just this conduit. They're protected legally from liability by this law. So here's an interesting question, or rather, I think the answer is interesting. Which candidate didn't like this law and wanted to get rid of it in 2020? Was it Trump or Biden? Not just weaken it, but who was actually campaigning saying, let's get rid of the law entirely? The answer was both. This is one of the rare bipartisan things. Both candidates agreed on this. Things have changed a little bit since then, but I'll just give you the punchline. Biden and liberal side wanted to get rid of it because they feel that misinformation and offensive and harmful things are spreading and we need some responsibility. Trump and the conservative side wanted to get rid of it because they felt these companies could just censor people however they want, inhibit free speech. And some people think that they do that more to liberal than conservative voices. And they want, basically, they're saying that this law is protecting, that these companies are violating free speech, but they can't be sued for it. So getting rid of this law would allow them to be culpable for their infringement of free speech violations. Anyway, it's interesting that they both had the same target in sights, but for completely opposite reasons. All right, I want to leave time for questions, so let me end here. I will stop my share and open it up. I have a few minutes extra, by the way, so if people have to go at one, feel free, but if you want to stay an extra 5 or 10 minutes, that's fine with me.
Excellent. So we'll get started answering some questions and then we'll see where we're at. And Noah has also graciously offered his email address so you can follow up with him personally if you have questions that go unanswered.
Yeah, and please do. I really would like to hear from people. I'm happy to do that.
Awesome. So definitely reach out. The first question we'll take from one of our live questions. Currently, organizations, well, this is a question. Are organizations no longer allowed by Google to host anonymous websites?
Yes. So wait, say that one more time. I want to make sure I get it.
Are anonymous websites allowed essentially on Google? Are organizations allowed to publish anonymous websites on Google?
Yeah, that's a good question. So in the advertising realm, that was allowed until very recently, and now Google no longer allows it. So what that means is if I want to have an ad that Google places. So I'm not a Google site, but I want Google to place an ad on me. It used to be that I could just, Google would know who I was and wouldn't care, but I would just be anonymous to the advertiser. That got disallowed quite recently. But it's still gamed in that a lot of people will kind of spoof URLs. You can kind of still hide who you are unofficially. So officially it's no longer allowed, but if I'm a fake news producer, I can kind of find ways of kind of hiding my track. But that's for advertising. For search, I think there was less of a chance to be anonymous in the first place because any site that shows up in search has a URL. So in theory, you can kind of track it down. But there's a question of the funding. So anonymity is not kind of literally allowed in the sense that there's always a URL you can see. But what we found happening is there's all these vast networks of local news organizations, like I forget the names, but they always sound like the Grand Canyon Times, the Denver, whatever. They sound like reasonable local news. And it turns out that there's this huge network of them that was funded by right-wing political organizations. And legally, you have to declare when you're kind of funded for a political purpose, but they were skirting around that by kind of lying about who they were and where the funding was coming from. So it wasn't anonymous, but it was definitely hiding the full truth of their story.
Excellent, thank you. Going back to your conversation about YouTube, if 500 videos are posted each hour and YouTube cannot review all of them, how are they prohibiting anti-vaccine videos?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that's where we have to use machine learning, and here's how they do it. And this, I'm glad you asked, because what I'm about to say is how all the platforms, whatever moderation they choose to do, this is how they at least attempt to do it. So in many cases, they don't choose to do it. In many cases, they're not successful, but this is the basic idea. You have a team of human moderators, and most of these companies, it's like 10 to 20,000 people, except they're contract workers. They're never at the Google headquarters. By the way, YouTube is owned by Google, so I'll lump that into the same. But they're never like working at Facebook or Google or YouTube. They don't have the benefits. There was a Wall Street Journal investigation a couple of years ago that found they get paid like $13 an hour. So don't think of this as like a high-tech job. This is like, more like a minimum wage type of job. So this team of 10 to 20,000 people, what they do is for Google search, they'll rate the searches. For YouTube, they'll watch videos. They are humans that label. So let's go back to the specific Vax one. These humans will watch a bunch of videos on YouTube, and whenever there's anti-vax ones, they'll label it as such. They'll kind of click something. And this produces the training data. If these 10,000 people watch, let's say 100,000 or a million videos, now there's a million videos YouTube has where it knows exactly which ones have anti-vax rhetoric and which ones don't, and even where within the video, what specific passage triggered it. So what happens is, even with 10,000 people, you're watching a tiny fraction of all the videos. But YouTube and all the other companies, they'll use the label data, what the humans have produced, for the training data to basically train a machine learning algorithm to extrapolate. So think of it this way. I don't know the percentages, let's make up numbers, but maybe the humans can watch like 0.1% of all of YouTube. Even that's probably way too much. But whatever it is, the algorithms will kind of learn what they did and try to extend that. That's why they have a chance, because they have some human label data, but it's also why it's not guaranteed, because the algorithm, it's not the same as the original human. Even the original humans are not perfect. The algorithm has even more problematic aspects. But video is especially hard because text we're a little better at dealing with.
Excellent, thank you. All right, another question from our audience. A Bentley parent, also a library science professional with a lot of awareness of the data used behind the scenes. For lay people who are content consumers, if there were a term other than fake news, like tabloid, in print formats that would help people better categorize malintended content or ads, is there a better label? Because fake news has made it too easy for people to argue that all news is fake. So
yeah, that's right, and I'm guilty of this. Technically, fake news is kind of what was in the air during Trump's years. Unsurprisingly, he loved the term. Nowadays, we actually try to avoid using the term, even though it's in the title of my book, and I apologize. But the main ones we try to distinguish, because as you said exactly, there's different categories. So some terms that are good to be aware of, Misinformation is sort of anything that's wrong, but possibly unintentionally. Disinformation is when you're deliberately trying to deceive people. So that there is a difference between, like, a Russian organization that's trying to co-opt our election by spreading disinformation versus people who just post things that they don't know if it's true or not, which could potentially be misinformation. So fake news, you're right, it often is used to belittle media. Any story you don't like, you just say, oh, that's fake news. I think part of why I chose it is because it's familiar. It's a shorter word, and maybe I'm trying to reclaim it a little bit. Trump took it to put down mainstream news, and I'm trying to reclaim it and say, there is fake news out there. It's not the stuff he was talking about. It's the news that's just not true. But you're right. Technically, we don't use fake news anymore.
On that topic of fake news, we do have a few people asking, as consumers, how do you navigate the news landscape? And are there better trusted sources to stay aware of as it evolves?
I would say, it gets into dangerous political territory. I can't say like this paper or this paper, but I'll just say, here's one way of thinking about it. Where does the money come from? If you're subscription based, you're having people commit money monthly or annually to receive this product. If that product disappoints you, maybe finding stories that are tabloidy, that are clickbait, that are just untrue, over a while that tends to disappoint people, and they're not going to want to pay for that. Not always, but often. So generally, the subscription-based newspapers tend to be more reliable because their economic model is they can't displease their users over the long run. Whereas the advertising revenue, it doesn't mean it's worse, it doesn't mean it's bad. There's plenty of good papers that are advertising revenue. But just remember, at the end of the day, they make money based entirely on traffic. So any headline that brings in users is money, that's gold to them. They have to write in that way. If you're subscription, you have to write in a way to keep people reading for a year. If you're ad revenue, you write whatever brings in the most traffic at that moment. So I'll just put that out there and mention some examples. New York Times, Washington Post are liberal-leaning subscription papers. Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, those are more, a little bit more right-leaning subscription. Those are all perfectly legitimate. They're not perfect all the time. They're not, covering all the diverse perspectives they should. They definitely get some things wrong. But for the most part, it really hurts their reputations when they just get things patently wrong. The fact that you can think of examples when one of those papers got something wrong tells you a lot, because it hurts their subscribers. People literally unsubscribe when something goes wrong. Whereas, more clickbait type of organizations, it doesn't matter. If each headline kind of speaks for itself, you tend to not follow the organization as much as the headline. Whatever is catchy, you click. So generally, that's my my advice, is just think of where the money's coming from. But it's not perfect. There's good and bad newspapers of all kinds. For individual content, it's harder to say. There are some fact-checking. Someone posted a question before we started. Are there good fact-checking organizations? I don't want to just like list a bunch, but yeah, there are some quite reasonably ones. One that I like, so Snopes I think is pretty good. PolitiFact. One that I like that's based in London, that's actually like a nonprofit there. It's called a charity organization, is called Full Fact. And what I like about Full Fact is they really blend human with machine learning, with algorithms. So they'll do these cool things, and this is another topic I wanted to mention. You can't have humans fact check everything. There's just too much stuff on the internet. But we also can't have AI fact check because it's just nowhere close to be able to understand the world and that level. What you can do, and what's helpful, is anytime there's some rumor floating around or some fake news story, some misinformation, there's not just one instance of it. There's thousands or millions of variations of it floating around. So what the algorithms do is they'll kind of cluster that. They'll say, oh, all these thousands of claims are all variations of the same one fundamental claim. So they'll bring those all together. The human fact checkers just have to check that claim once and say, yeah, it's true or not. And then the algorithm will kind of spread that out to all the others. So the algorithm is not doing the fact checking, it's expediting the human fact checkers. And that's how Full Fact and some others do it. And I think that's a very, it's not flawless, but it's a very good way. It's more reliable than thinking a computer will just do it entirely on its own. So those are useful. And I personally use Snopes and PolitiFact, and those, they're helpful.
Excellent. And I know Bethany put full fact, the link to that
Yeah,
in,
okay,
in
perfect.
the chat. So if anyone wants to go there, they can. Another popular question that was asked in registration and also here is, what level of responsibility should digital platforms, social media companies be required to assume, not just legally, but ethically?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say because I'd love to say, oh, they should care more about democracy in the world, but that's not true, right? I mean, think about how corporations are structured. We actually have laws in the US that their fidelity is to shareholders. If they have to choose between actions that will increase their shareholder value when you're a publicly traded company versus helping democracy in some abstract sense, it's not that they're ethically choosing the wrong thing. They're actually legally required to do the wrong thing in that case. What we hope is that we're reaching the point where peddling misinformation and hate speech and all these harmful things is so abhorrent and it's so well known to society, we're right at the tipping point, perhaps, that it starts to impact shareholder value. So if people start deleting their accounts, if advertisers start boycotting, then we've aligned the priorities. Then the corporation can actually say, look, if we allow this harmful stuff to propagate, we're actually losing bottom line revenue, we're losing investment, our stock price is going down. Like when the Wall Street Journal investigation came out about Facebook a month ago, Facebook prices, stock went down 5% in a day or 10% or something. So I think we just have to think in those terms. It's not like the question is how evil or good is Mark Zuckerberg or these other people. It's the way capitalism and corporations work is they have to do what is right for their shareholders, making them money. What we need to do as a society is find ways that these are kind of more aligned, that doing these good things, dealing with these sort of externalities, you can call it, these harmful costs, actually hurt the company. And there have been incidences where something really bad has happened and a bunch of employees will walk out. Like Google had a contract to develop AI that helped target missiles that was going to be used overseas. A bunch of computer scientists and people working there said, I don't want my products to be used to kill people. So they staged a walkout. That impacted Google directly, and they pulled out of that contract. There was an advertiser boycott of Facebook when a lot of news came out about this racism in their advertising. That had an impact, not just because people were pissed, but because it hurt their stock price. So it actually gave them a financial incentive to do the morally right thing. So I think we just have to kind of recognize that's the goal, is to align our financial and our moral incentives more closely, which, how do we do that? I think transparency is the main way. If we understand the good and the bad of these companies, hopefully the bad will hurt their public image and their stock price to the point that they'll be discouraged from doing the bad. They'll work extra hard, because it's not up to me or any individual, even Zuckerberg, to decide the balance of how good and how bad and what they should do. They have to be receptive to financial forces. So we have to use that as the motivation.
And now we're going to pivot to a question about bots. So bots are now filling out forms, opting in for email marketing with fake email IDs. Can you talk a little bit more about the recent bot trends? Are they using GPT as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a huge concern. So these bots are fake accounts. It's back in 2016, we had a lot of bots coming from Russia that were, influencing the election, trying to push it in the favor of Trump. And they were pretty primitive. When you read the news, it sounds really fancy, but they were just like resharing, retweeting, replying, liking stuff. They weren't really interacting. But with GPT-3, we have this fancy language model that can generate text. We haven't seen much of this yet, but it's probably due in some sense that now the bots will have this capability of writing comments. The one example I know is on Reddit. Someone found a Reddit user that was just posting prolifically, like lengthy comments and that just way faster than a human could do. And it turned out that Reddit user was someone using GPT-3. They weren't doing anything harmful or manipulative. They were doing an experiment to see what would happen. And it turned out it got away with it for a while. We actually think that the user who was doing it was the one who kind of caught themselves because they wanted to draw attention. So it seems like the potential's there. Then the question comes down to, well, how do you access GPT-3 and use it? It's a private company and they charge money for their product. So if you wanted to use it for millions of bots doing lots of things, you'd have to pay them. So then the question becomes, maybe large organizations will choose to spend their money this way. I mean, it's horrible, but it's also not that different than an advertising campaign, right? You're just trying to spend money to spread your message.
Yeah.
So if this stuff is free, which there are open source versions that are coming out, it might tip the scales in different ways, but we're not quite ready to answer that question, but it's a great question of how much more sophisticated are these bots going to become. But unfortunately, we've noticed that they're pretty effective even at the primitive level. So whether they need that extra boost, we're not sure yet. But on the other hand, that detecting them, those methods have also improved a lot. So a lot of them do get blocked and deleted. But it's harder in other settings. Like a lot of the news that's come out is in other countries, there's way less moderation from, meaning the US companies like Facebook are not moderating their product in other countries as much. And hate speech, misinformation, and bot accounts are way more rampant, unfortunately. They're just not dedicating the resources they need.
Great. Well, thank you, Noah. We have a few more questions, but we'll leave those for follow-up. So we will send those to Noah and he will reach out to you with any questions, or you can feel free to reach out to him. Noah, any final thoughts before we close out today's session?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people want to know like what to do about this balance between censorship and free speech. How do we change the platform? Basically, what do we do? You can be aware of these problems and what do we do? And my advice is just, I don't want to proclaim any answer because I don't know the answer. And even if I did, why should you trust me? I'm just one person. But I just think it's really important to try to get past the superficial layer of the headlines. And even the good newspapers that I like that I mentioned, often the headlines are kind of scandalous, like here the latest horrible thing Mark Zuckerberg did or that Facebook did. I think it's important to go a little deeper than that and really try to understand. I've been trying to advocate this kind of financial perspective. Don't think of the question as, is this person or this company evil or good? Think of it as what are their financial motivations? And as I said, this helps us understand why Facebook acts the way it does, why Google acts the way it does. It also helps us understand the fake news publishers. So try to get past the kind of emotional reaction, even though it's hard to do, because it is very upsetting to read a lot of these headlines. And just think, why is someone benefiting from doing this? Because they're making money. How do we stop them from making money from doing that? That's the thing. You're never going to talk someone into doing the right thing morally. I mean, it's difficult. But if we think about the financial motivations, I think we have a chance. For free speech versus censorship, I'll just mention one point, which is free speech means you can say what you want. It doesn't mean you're guaranteed that an algorithm will amplify your voice. So people are very upset when Facebook takes down a post or downranks it. There's nothing remotely in the Constitution about free speech that says this private company constitutionally must amplify this idiot's voice. And if they don't, then that's a violation of free speech. So do not confuse free speech with guaranteed private company amplification. That's the debate we're having. These companies are amplifying voices, and yes, they can choose whether to do so or not. That is not a free speech issue. So sorry for being passionate on that, but it gets just distorted by so many people so often.
Well, thank you so much, Noah. We really appreciate your time and we appreciate everybody hanging in there, especially those of you who've stayed on for this extra Q&A session. Definitely feel free to reach out to Noah. I'm sure he'd appreciate it. And thank you, everyone, and see you next time.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. And thanks for the great turnout.